Let's get some hands together, gang, for Gideon AI.
Here's the talent build I've been using personally. So, the core concept of Shadow Priest tanking is that you open up with Mind Blast on the kill target, hit Shadow Word Pain on all targets, and then spam either Mind Flay or Touch of Weakness, an Undead Priest racial spell, until the end of the fight. This works very well in dungeons as a DPS tank because you do good AoE damage but are a bit squishier than plate and shield classes. However, for outputting single target threat, it is somewhat lackluster. It's been executed in both dungeons and raids so far, but I'll be focusing on dungeons for this video as I don't have any raid tanking experience myself. I also don't recommend executing this build at earlier levels than 60, although it can be done, so I'll be focusing the math side of things from a level 60 perspective. The Mind Flay version of this spec for non-undead races relies on the martyrdom spell batching trick that I detailed in my previous video. Link in the description. As always, there are two necessary aspects of tanking: damage mitigation and threat. We'll cover mitigation first because many believe that priests are one of the squishiest classes in the game, when in fact they are superb in this area when spec'd for it. First up, we'll tackle physical damage mitigation tools, starting with Shadow Form. I tested with a glorious hunter on Scarum server named Fenacon, who shot me while wearing different levels of armor with Shadow Form equipped, and we confirmed that Shadow Form applies its damage reduction independently of armor. This simplifies our math. Physical damage taken is reduced by 15% and then is passed into armor reduction calculations. Next up is Inner Fire. Baseline, it provides 1,400 armor straight up. When talented, it provides 2,000. This alone puts us very favorably compared to other classes. When it runs out in mid-combat, because 20 charges isn't much, recasting it will still inflict 60 AoE threat divided amongst the enemies in combat, so using up that GCD isn't the end of the world. It's mostly irritating for its mana cost. Finally, on the armor side of things is actual cloth gear you're wearing. Normally a level 60 cloth wearer will have around 500 armor from items. However, there are many ways to get additional points from odd means. The most obvious one is through non-cloth gear, like weapons, trinkets, and jewelry that have the plus armor stat. However, for cloth specifically, you can also wear the 3 cloth dungeon sets, which each have plus 200 armor as their 2-piece set bonus, and, when worn together, grant a total of 600 extra armor. In the Rothi Basin reputation rewards, one can find the Defilers / Highlanders, cloth boots, cloth belts, and epaulettes, which all have roughly double, sometimes triple the amount of armor of a normal cloth piece. And in Phase 5, we'll be seeing the Cloth Ironweave set, which also has similar extreme levels of armor. 2 additional pieces of cloth armor which have absurd armor levels are the Gloves of the Immortal and the Necro Knight's Garb, both of which have such high armor that they were often given to Feral Druid tanks back in vanilla. Getting 4,000 and even upwards of 5,000 armor is not too hard for a priest, especially if you start counting buffs and consumables. Also worth mentioning in this area is Power Word Shield, which is the only direct heal type ability available in Shadow Form. I typically only use this on myself in times when I know my healer is unable to heal me or when he's dropping down in mana and I have extra to spare, but it can help when cast on others in the group who are taking damage as well. It's also decent for casting regular spells that normally would get slowed due to pushback from taking damage, but most of the time it pops really quickly, so it's not always a guarantee. Power Word Shield applies normal healing threat to all those in combat with you. Renew is something you can cast on yourself before combat and before entering Shadow Form, but that option is so mana costly that I don't bother myself. Speaking of normal heals, you can also drop out of Shadow Form and heal yourself or others if necessary. However, unless I've been crit recently and procced Martyrdom, I won't use this technique because the spell pushback from taking damage will slow down your healing to a crawl. Vampiric Embrace varies in usefulness depending on the situation as well as your gear. If you're undead and spamming Touch of Weakness, forget about it. You're barely dealing any single target damage at all. However, if you're using Mind Flay, your damage output can provide a respectable amount of self-healing and a huge amount of AoE healing. This is not just useful because of the amount of healing done, but also because you generate standard healing-based threat from the exchange. Vampiric Embrace also deals 60 threat on cast against the target. Devouring Plague is a nice self-heal over time, but is extremely mana expensive, so I don't recommend using this unless you want a fight ended quickly and you know you won't run out of mana. Devouring Plague doesn't generate any healing threat, just damage threat. Indirectly related to mitigation is the priest talent Unbreakable Will, which grants 15% resistance to all stuns, fears, and silences, all of which can ruin your day as a tank. Because 15% still ain't much, I'd recommend planning your dungeon runs in advance so that you don't end up wiping everyone because you got silenced for 10 seconds straight and you couldn't dispel. Priests also get access to the talent Spell Warding, which reduces all spell damage taken by 10%, which includes attacks that aren't technically spells but deal elemental damage, as well as the talent Blessed Recovery, which heals back 25% of physical critical damage taken over 6 seconds. Unfortunately, when you receive 2 crits, then it overwrites the first heal over time. I'm not actually sure if the self-heal causes threat or not, but it's still a decent talent. Also, you can opt to take the Blackout talent, which gives a 10% chance to stun enemies for 3 seconds when you hit them with a shadow spell. It's good, but it can cause unintended situations when you want to manipulate the position of an enemy mob. Most bosses are also immune to stun anyway. Psychic Scream is yet another indirect form of damage mitigation, yet one that is extremely dangerous and should only be used if you know it can't backfire or risking it is necessary to avoid a wipe. It deals 120 threat to all enemies hit by it, so it's not bad in that regard, but it can throw off your party members in terms of actually killing things. To summarize this section, a priest fully tricked out for maximum damage mitigation is roughly equal to a warrior in plate wearing no shield. Priests also have 900 less health due to lower innate stamina, and warriors can parry, but the difference is still closer than people realize. Moving on now to threat output. For those unaware, 1 damage equals 1 threat. Mind Blast deals double its damage in threat instead. The cooldown can make it awkward to fit in alongside Martyrdom procs. There are also a pair of gloves that you can get starting at PvP rank 7 that give you a 50% chance to avoid casting pushback on Mind Blast, so they're a really good option for tanking. However, in order to get the pushback reduction to 100%, you'd need to be Alliance for the Paladin's improved concentration aura. Mind Blast scales at 43% of your spell damage. Mind Flay deals normal damage threat in addition to debuff threat, which simply adds 120 threat to the initial cast of the spell. With just shadow talents and no gear, it'll deal 275 threat per second on average. If your weapon is 3.0 speed or less, you can use this macro to melee every time you cast Mind Flay. This is often relevant because you'll be in melee for most tanking encounters. It doesn't deal too much damage due to the caster class melee damage penalty, which I'll be running tests later to find out exactly how much less damage, but every little bit helps. Mind Flay scales at 15% of your spell damage per second. Shadow Word Pain is one of the best damage over time spells in the game. Because of this, it's also really good for dealing threat. Ideally, you will use this on the kill target after opening with Mind Blast, and then cast it on the rest of the enemies in the area. It's pretty mana intensive, but you can look at it as a 1000 plus damage instant cast ability in terms of the value it provides over the course of a fight. For Undead specifically, Touch of Weakness deals a variable amount of threat. Firstly, it deals normal damage threat to the enemy who strikes you first after casting the spell. This damage scales at 10% of your spell damage. Secondly, it deals level-based debuff threat. Debuff threat is calculated by taking the level you learned a spell and doubling that number. So Touch of Weakness rank 1 is learned at level 10, so that debuff deals 20 threat, while rank 6 is learned at level 60 and deals 120 threat from its debuff. Thirdly, Touch of Weakness counts as a buff to yourself, and so it deals level-based buff threat. Buffs generate threat equal to the level you learned the spell, so rank 6 Touch of Weakness deals 60 threat. However, this is divided amongst all enemies in combat with you, so its usefulness varies depending on the size of the fight and what target you're trying to build aggro on. Timing is key with Touch of Weakness, and to make sure I'm hitting the right target, I personally use the add-on Weapon Swing Timer, which lets me see when my targeted enemy is about to attack me. If you spam Touch of Weakness, you might end up generating aggro on a secondary target rather than the kill target. Most enemies don't have such slow attacks that it lowers your threat output too much, but enemies with like 3-second long attacks may demand using wand casts or mind flays in between touches of weakness. Touch of Weakness is also instant cast, so you can melee in between casts automatically if you have a 1.5 speed weapon or faster. Although melee matters less here compared to Mind Flay, because with Mind Flay you can use two-handers, which deal more damage overall. AoE buffs, like the prayers of Fortitude, Spirit, and Shadow Protection, will generate 60 threat per player or pet caught in the AoE buff. 56 threat for Shadow Protection. In a 5-man group with no pets, this equals 300 or 280 buff threat. In a 5-man group with 4 warlocks or hunters, this equals 540 or 504 buff threat. Of course, it's also extremely expensive in the mana department, so the cases in which you'd want to use this are limited, but it's worth mentioning. Mind Control is also known to generate a large amount of single target threat towards the caster, but it's only usable against humanoids. Please comment below if you can find out the threat generation mechanic at work here. So to sum up, threat generation is kind of limited due to the generally poor scaling of the Shadow Priest abilities. Assuming no plus spell damage gear, you're getting an initial burst of 1,200 threat from Mind Blast, followed by 50 threat per second from Shadow Word Pain, and 225 threat per second if you manage all of your martyrdom procs perfectly in unison with your Mind Flays. For Undead, if you hit all of your touches of weakness on the same target, you get an average of 145 threat per second in addition to the 50 from Shadow Word Pain. 200 to 300 threat per second is not great, especially if your buddies are dealing significantly more than that in damage, or just like to avoid killing Skull first. With a decent amount of plus spell damage or plus shadow damage gear, let's say plus 200, then you get an initial burst rather of 1,370 threat from Mind Blast, an average of 60 threat per second from Shadow Word Pain, and an average of 255 threat per second from Mind Flay, or 165 threat per second from Touches of Weakness, for 315 or 225 threat per second respectively. Consumables like the Gift of Arthas, Oil of Immolation, grenades, or reflective damage gear all also contribute greatly to tanking and can help make up completely for the threat deficiencies of the Shadow Priest. But those tools are available to all classes anyway, so I won't cover them specifically in this video. In combination, what you get with a Shadow Priest tank is a tank that deals more AoE damage than many thanks to Shadow Word Pain, but is a bit squishier than most prot warriors and fails to scale very highly in terms of threat output. All of the shortcomings of the Shadow Priest tank, or any tank for that matter, can be solved with powerful consumables, but I don't personally form my opinions of specs on that basis. Looking to the future, even though Blood Elves also gain access to Touch of Weakness in the Burning Crusade, DPS numbers get multiplied by about 5 times in that expansion, while level-based buff and debuff threat only increases from base 60 to base 70, which is an increase of 1.1x. So unless Touch of Weakness spell damage scaling was part of the unlisted increases to spell damage scalings in patch 2.0, then Mind Flay will probably be the only option left until Wrath of the Lich King. Thanks for watching, let me know if you have any questions or comments, and remember, go crazy.